Welcome to Tales by Tochi. Please don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. Kenneth Madu sat by the expansive window of his 30-story penthouse, staring blankly at the glittering skyline of the city he practically owned. His empire stretched far beyond what the eyes could see. Construction companies, oil firms, real estate giants, and luxury brands all bore his invisible signature. Yet tonight, as he nursed a glass of untouched wine, he felt poorer than any man walking the streets below. It was a peculiar loneliness that gripped him, not the loneliness of being without company, but the deeper, heavier loneliness of not being truly seen. Every woman he met seemed to come alive at the mention of his name, but their eyes gleamed not with love or admiration for who he was but with hunger for his wealth. Dates felt like business meetings, relationships like negotiations. "Kenneth, you deserve someone who loves you for you," his late mother had once told him. Her words echoed now more than ever, bouncing off the cold marble floors and gold-plated walls of his empty home. Wealth had given him everything except the one thing he craved most: genuine love. As the city lights flickered beneath him, an idea began to form in his restless mind, reckless yet liberating. If love would not come to Kenneth Madu the billionaire, perhaps it would come to Kenneth the beggar. 2 days later, Kenneth Madu walked the streets no one expected him to tread. Gone were his designer suits, silk ties, and polished Italian shoes. In their place, he wore torn jeans, a faded shirt several sizes too large, and old sandals that barely clung to his feet. Dirt smeared his face and hands, and an old beanie covered his once immaculately styled hair. For the first time in his adult life, Kenneth was invisible. People bumped into him without apology, vendors shooed him away from their shops, and drivers yelled curses at him as he crossed the streets. His heart ached with a pain he had never known. He was seeing the world from the ground up now, a world harsh and unkind. He spent hours sitting at corners, sometimes pretending to sleep, sometimes simply watching. Women he would have once dated without blinking an eye now curled their lips in disgust at him. Men who once bowed to him in meetings now stepped on him without noticing. Yet amidst the hurt, Kenneth found something he hadn't felt in years: clarity. Here, stripped of his wealth and titles, he was nothing but a man. And it was here, among the broken, that he hoped to find someone who could see him not for the size of his bank account, but for the beating heart within his chest. As dusk fell on the third day of his experiment, Kenneth leaned against the wall of a rundown bakery, his stomach grumbling from genuine hunger. His legs ached and fatigue weighed heavily on his shoulders. Doubt began to creep in. Maybe this was foolish after all. Maybe the world had grown too shallow, too greedy, too blind to kindness. He was about to get up and walk away when a soft voice broke through his despair. "Excuse me, sir, are you okay?" Kenneth looked up and saw her, Amara. She had the kindest eyes he had ever seen, warm pools of concern staring back at him. Her hair was tied up in a simple bun, her clothes neat but humble, and there was a sincerity about her that melted the walls around his heart. Before he could answer, she knelt beside him, offering him a sandwich wrapped in brown paper. "You look hungry," she said, smiling shyly. "Please take this." Kenneth's fingers trembled as he accepted the gift, overwhelmed by the simple act of kindness. In that moment he realized something profound. Sometimes all it takes to change a life is one person brave enough to care. And as Amara sat beside him, chatting softly and offering to help him clean up, Kenneth knew deep down, his search was over. He had found her. Kenneth could hardly believe how quickly his world had shifted. Days ago, he had been the untouchable titan perched atop marble floors, but now, in the dirty alleys of the city, he was no more than another face in the sea of poverty. The streets were unforgiving. Their language was survival, their currency, suspicion. Kenneth's first few attempts to interact with people had been met with disdain. A woman had once hissed at him to go find work, when he asked for directions. A man spat near his foot, calling him a lazy parasite. Even the children, innocent as they should have been, avoided him as if his rags carried disease. It was a painful education. Every sneer, every turned head, every slammed door painted a new stroke of reality onto the canvas of his understanding. He realized, with growing sadness, that money had built him walls so high he had never truly seen the world that existed beyond them. At night, he would find a secluded bench or empty stairwell to sleep, the cold gnawing at his bones. Kenneth knew he could end the ordeal anytime, slip back into his Rolls-Royce and into his penthouse. But he refused. If he was to find love untainted by wealth, he had to embrace this path fully. It wasn't just the physical discomfort that wore him down, it was the emotional erosion. Loneliness pressed against his chest like an unrelenting weight. His friends, his employees, even his security team, all unaware of where he was, lived their lives without a thought for him. No one missed the beggar hunched by the bakery or the man who scavenged for coins dropped on sidewalks. As each day passed, Kenneth's faith in humanity began to thin. He saw women dressed in elegance ignore crying children on the streets. He saw men in expensive cars splash water on struggling hawkers without a second glance. Was kindness truly dead? Or had wealth poisoned the souls of men so deeply that compassion was now a weakness? As the days stretched into a week, Kenneth found himself questioning not just others but himself too. Had he been any better? How many times had he, from the tinted windows of his car, overlooked a soul in need? Humbled and heartbroken, Kenneth realized that this journey was transforming him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He wasn't just searching for love anymore, he was rediscovering what it meant to be human. By the 6th day, Kenneth's body screamed for rest, but his spirit was tougher. His beard had grown wild, his hands blistered from sleeping rough, and the once pristine skin he had pampered was now cracked and dirty. He had memorized the rhythm of the streets, the times when bakery owners tossed leftover bread, the alleys that stayed quiet at night, the rare kind faces among oceans of apathy. Still, loneliness clawed at him, a desperate, biting thing. One evening, while curled up near a bakery's trash bin, Kenneth whispered into the dark sky, "Please, let there be someone." It was a cry not just for love, but for a sign that goodness still existed. His eyelids drooped, heavy with exhaustion and silent prayers, not knowing that destiny was already walking towards him, carrying warm bread in one hand and a heart full of kindness in the other. Amara's life was no fairy tale either. She worked 2 jobs, one at a local pharmacy and another cleaning offices at night, just to keep her modest apartment and help her sick mother back home in the village. Every day she passed the same streets on her way to work, streets filled with vendors, loud music, and people desperate to survive. But Amara had something many had lost, a heart still tender, a soul still soft. On the 7th evening, as she walked past the bakery, a figure caught her attention. A man slumped against the wall, his head bowed, his body barely covered by tattered clothes. Something about the sight made her pause. Where others saw dirt, Amara saw pain. Where others saw a nuisance, she saw a story. Moving closer, she noticed the man's trembling hands and the hollow look in his eyes, and without hesitation, she pulled the little sandwich she had bought from her bag, the only meal she could afford that night, and knelt down beside him. "Are you okay, sir?" she asked, her voice soft yet firm. Kenneth could hardly believe his eyes. Here, after days of rejection, was a young woman offering him kindness without expecting anything in return. His throat tightened with emotion as he accepted the sandwich with shaking hands. Amara smiled, noticing his hesitance, and reassured him, "It's all right. I just want to help." She offered to clean him up, even suggesting he come with her to her home where she could find him better clothes. Kenneth's heart swelled with gratitude. Her kindness was pure, free from judgment, free from any hidden agenda. He followed her, keeping his head down, wondering at the strange twist of fate that had brought this angel into his life. Along the way she chatted with him, asking no intrusive questions, just sharing small talk to make him feel human again. Her warmth wrapped around him like a blanket, shielding him momentarily from the cold, brutal world he had come to know. When they arrived at her small apartment, Kenneth marveled at its simplicity. A tiny living room with old but clean furniture, a small kitchen that smelled faintly of spices, and walls decorated with pictures of family and handwritten notes of encouragement. "Sit here," Amara said, pulling out a chair and bustling about to prepare a bath for him. She gave him a clean towel, a worn t-shirt that once belonged to her father, and soap. Kenneth sat there, overwhelmed. No woman had ever given him anything without expecting something bigger in return. Here he was, a man who could buy 10 of these apartments without blinking, being treated like a king in a queen's humble castle. As Amara heated water and set out everything he needed, Kenneth realized with stunning clarity, this was the woman he had been searching for, not just someone to love, but someone who could love beyond appearances. Just as Amara prepared the water and turned to help Kenneth, the front door burst open with a loud bang and David, Amara's boyfriend, stormed into the room. He stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes darting between Amara and the disheveled figure of Kenneth, confusion turning into disgust within seconds. "What the hell is this?" David bellowed, his voice dripping with mockery. Amara rushed forward, trying to explain, but David was in no mood to listen. His laughter filled the small room, cruel and cutting. "You brought a filthy beggar into your home? God, Amara, you're pathetic," he sneered. Kenneth lowered his head, feeling the sting of humiliation, but it was nothing compared to the pain flashing across Amara's face. She tried again to explain, her voice shaking, but David cut her off, brandishing his phone with a triumphant smirk. I don't need this nonsense anymore. I just signed a contract with Alhaji Bako's daughter. She's rich, classy and worth my time, unlike you. Behind David, two older figures appeared. His parents, who had clearly been listening in the hallway. They joined in the attack, ridiculing Amara for being too cheap, and too stupid, to land a man of value. The small apartment echoed with their venomous words. Kenneth clenched his fists, his heart hammering in his chest. Every instinct in him screamed to reveal who he truly was and end this cruelty, but he restrained himself. This wasn't the time. Instead he stood up, still in his filthy clothes, and placed himself between Amara and the verbal assault. That's enough, he said, his voice steady. David and his parents gawked at him, stunned that a beggar would dare to speak. A man is measured by the size of his heart, not the size of his wallet, Kenneth continued. His words didn't impress them. If anything, they laughed harder, but Kenneth didn't care. He wasn't speaking for them. He was speaking for Amara, who needed to know that she was worth defending. David sneered, grabbed his designer jacket and stormed out, his parents trailing behind him, still hurling insults. As the door slammed shut, the silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Amara collapsed onto the couch, tears streaming down her face. Kenneth sat beside her, not touching her, just offering his presence. For the first time in a long time, Amara allowed herself to cry openly, not because she had lost a man like David, but because kindness still existed in a world that often felt so cruel. As she wiped her eyes and turned to Kenneth with a small, grateful smile, a bond was formed between them, fragile yet powerful. Little did either of them know, their lives had just been irreversibly entwined, and the journey ahead would be filled with trials, revelations, and a love neither could have ever imagined. The days following David's betrayal were the darkest Amara had ever known. Word spread quickly among her friends and neighbors, not because she said anything, but because David made sure of it. He paraded his new relationship like a trophy, taking photos with Alhaji Bako's daughter, posting lavish dinners and expensive gifts online, making sure Amara would see them. His betrayal wasn't content with just leaving. He needed to rub salt into her open wounds. People whispered behind her back, some openly mocked her, and others, out of pity, withdrew as though her suffering were contagious. Kenneth watched her crumble slowly under the weight of humiliation. Each time she tried to smile, it faltered halfway. Each time she laughed, it ended in a sigh. In the quiet of her small apartment, Amara would sit by the window, staring out into the night, wondering what she had done to deserve such public disgrace. And through it all, Kenneth stayed, never once leaving her side. David's cruelty didn't stop at emotional attacks. Emboldened by his newfound wealth, he sought to destroy what little hope Amara had left. One afternoon, Amara went for a job interview at a marketing company downtown, a company she had been dreaming to work with for months. She had barely finished introducing herself when the manager's phone rang. Within minutes, she was told the position was no longer available. Confused, she left the building, only to receive a text message from David that read, "Stay in your lane, loser. This world doesn't belong to people like you." Rage boiled inside her, but more than that, despair began to take root. Every interview afterward played out the same way, hope raised, then dashed. Kenneth saw the light in her dimming and it tore at him in ways he couldn't explain. He knew the extent of David's vindictiveness and vowed silently that one day, Amara would stand so high that even David's poisoned arrows couldn't reach her. Meanwhile, Kenneth himself was battling emotions he hadn't expected. He wasn't just feeling sympathy for Amara, he was falling deeply in love with her. He loved her resilience, her kindness, her refusal to become bitter despite everything she had suffered. Yet he wrestled with guilt. Was it fair to continue hiding who he truly was? Could she ever forgive him once she knew the truth? Each night he thought about revealing himself, but something held him back. Amara deserved to love a man for who he was, not for his money. Every time she offered him half of her last meal, every time she spoke of dreams beyond money and fame, Kenneth was reminded why he had begun this journey. He made himself a promise. When the time was right, he would make her his wife, and he would give her a life so beautiful that all her days of tears would become distant memories. But first, he had to see her through this storm without her ever knowing she had a billionaire standing quietly by her side. Amara's world grew smaller with each passing day. Her rent was overdue, her savings were almost gone, and with every failed job interview, the walls seemed to close in tighter. Friends she thought would stand by her grew distant. Even her pastor, a man she had served faithfully in church for years, subtly advised her to stay away from bad company, after hearing rumors spread by David's circle. She would wake up each morning battling the crushing weight of depression, forcing herself out of bed to search for jobs that were no longer available to her. Yet somehow, amidst the wreckage, she clung stubbornly to hope. She wasn't raised to be a quitter. Her mother's voice echoed in her ears every time she thought of giving up. "Trouble does not last always, my daughter. The darkest hour is just before the dawn." It was those words, and the quiet, unwavering presence of Kenneth, that kept her moving forward, one painful step at a time. Kenneth watched in awe as Amara fought battles that would have broken a lesser soul. She faced rejection after rejection with a dignity that made her shine even in her lowest moments. Sometimes, when she wasn't looking, Kenneth would slip small amounts of money into her bag, or arrange anonymous donations to her landlord to buy her a little more time. He didn't want her to feel indebted or pitted. He just wanted her to survive long enough to see the life that awaited her. Often he would suggest small jobs, helping to clean shops, babysitting, even assisting in community projects, jobs that kept her afloat without bruising her pride. Every little victory she achieved, every smile she managed to salvage from the ruins of her life, felt like a victory to Kenneth too. In protecting her, he found purpose again, a reason beyond wealth, a reason that made his heart beat with something more profound than any business deal ever had. But the pressure weighed heavily on both of them. Kenneth still lived the life of a beggar around her, and there were nights he sat awake in his own true penthouse, grappling with doubts. Would Amara forgive him for the deception when she found out? Would she see it as a betrayal rather than the proof of love he intended it to be? More importantly, could he continue watching her suffer while holding the power to end it with one word? It was a dilemma that tormented him endlessly. Yet, whenever he saw her, when she smiled despite the hunger, when she laughed despite the tears brimming in her eyes, Kenneth knew he had made the right decision. True love was not built on wealth, but on loyalty through hardship. He promised himself silently, under the stars that watched over their broken world, that when the moment came, he would reveal himself not to boast, but to kneel at her feet and say, "Thank you for seeing me when no one else did." David was not content to merely leave Amara broken. He needed to ensure she stayed broken. Using his growing influence from his relationship with Alhaji Bako's daughter, he made discreet phone calls to companies where Amara applied. With slick smiles and hidden malice, he whispered half-truths and outright lies, painting Amara as unstable, dishonest, and troublesome. Managers, wary of controversy, quickly discarded her applications without a second thought. David felt a twisted pleasure each time he blocked another door to her future, convincing himself that she deserved it for daring to shame him by clinging to a beggar. He viewed it as a personal victory each time he watched her hopes crumble. To him, it wasn't enough to move on. He needed to erase her from any future where she could stand tall and remind him of what he had thrown away. Amara, unaware of David's ongoing sabotage, grew increasingly confused and demoralized. She couldn't understand why employers who seemed impressed by her resume suddenly went cold after a single meeting. There were days when she would return home and crumble into Kenneth's arms, sobbing bitterly against the chest of the man she still thought was just another lost soul like herself. Maybe I'm just cursed," she whispered one night, her voice hollow with despair. Kenneth tightened his arms around her, swallowing the lump in his throat. Every instinct in him screamed to end her suffering, to reveal the truth, but he resisted. It wasn't time yet. Amara needed to know that her worth had nothing to do with a job title or David's cruel games. She needed to know that even if the world rejected her, she was still enough. And Kenneth was determined to be the mirror that reflected her true beauty back to her, no matter how long it took. Meanwhile, David's own web of deceit began to tighten around him, though he didn't realize it yet. His new fiancée was beginning to see the cracks in his smooth facade. His arrogance, his greed, his willingness to destroy lives for personal gain. She had agreed to the engagement partly for business benefits, but love was never truly part of the equation. And Kenneth, from behind the scenes, was quietly gathering information, setting plans into motion that would eventually lead to David's downfall. In the quiet corners of the city, where no one was watching, Kenneth was preparing the ultimate twist of fate, a lesson that would show David and the world that the heart one steps on today may just be the hand one begs from tomorrow. But first, Kenneth had to give Amara one thing she had never truly known, a love fierce enough to heal even the deepest wounds. In the darkness of Amara's growing despair, Kenneth became her unwavering light. Though he was still wrapped in the disguise of poverty, there was nothing fake about the loyalty and quiet strength he offered her. Whenever Amara stumbled, Kenneth was there, steadying her, reminding her with a look, a touch, a few encouraging words that she wasn't alone. He helped her find small tasks, washing dishes in a canteen, assisting old market women in carrying goods, all humble work, but enough to put food on her table and hope in her heart. Often, he would sit with her late into the night, listening as she poured out her fears and frustrations, never offering grand promises, only the comforting truth that someone cared. And though Amara often cried herself to sleep on those nights, she always woke up feeling a little less broken because Kenneth's presence was like an anchor keeping her from drifting into hopelessness. Their friendship blossomed in a way that transcended the ordinary. In each other's eyes they found silent understanding. Kenneth admired Amara's resilience, her ability to find laughter even in hardship, and the tenderness she still showed strangers despite her own wounds. Meanwhile, Amara found herself drawn to the mystery of the man beside her. She knew nothing about his past, he rarely spoke of it, but she saw in him a dignity that had nothing to do with wealth or status. It puzzled her sometimes how someone who had supposedly fallen so low could carry himself with such grace. But she never pressed him, she respected his silence just as he respected hers. Together they built a fragile world out of their shared pain, a tiny sanctuary that shielded them both from the cruelty waiting just outside her apartment door. In that little space, love grew quietly, unnoticed by the world but powerful enough to change everything. Yet even in the quiet joy of their companionship, Kenneth battled fierce inner turmoil. Every day he spent with Amara, pretending to be less than he was, deepened the guilt gnawing at his heart. Was it deception if it was born from love? Was it wrong to hide his identity when all he wanted was to be sure that Amara loved him? Not his name, not his fortune, but the flawed, scarred man behind them? He spent sleepless nights agonizing over when and how to reveal the truth. But each morning, when Amara would greet him with a tired smile, grateful simply for his presence, Kenneth would silence his conscience with one desperate thought: just a little longer. Let her love me for who I am first. He knew that when he finally unveiled the truth, it would change everything, for better or worse, and he wasn't ready to lose the purest thing he had ever known. The storms that battered Amara's life grew more violent as the days stretched into weeks. Jobs that should have been hers slipped through her fingers, friendships she thought were unshakable crumbled like brittle clay, and the whispers that once floated in corners now spoke openly in her presence. She's cursed, some said. Serves her right for thinking she was better than her fate, said others. Even the local stores, where she once bought goods on credit, began treating her with suspicion, as if poverty were a contagious disease she had willingly caught. Her little apartment, once her safe haven, felt more and more like a prison. Every corner seemed to echo with the sound of lost opportunities, broken dreams, and David's laughter. It was in this suffocating environment that Amara reached her breaking point. One evening, after being turned away from yet another interview where David's name had secretly poisoned her chances, she returned home, collapsed onto the floor, and wept as if her very soul was unraveling. Kenneth found her there hours later, still curled up, her body trembling from silent sobs. For a moment, he stood frozen, helpless against the sheer force of her pain. Then he knelt beside her, gathering her into his arms without a word. Amara clung to him, burying her face into his chest, her tears soaking his threadbare shirt. She poured out all her anger, her confusion, her exhaustion, the betrayal she couldn't understand, the cruelty she couldn't fight, the hope that had turned against her. Kenneth held her through it all, murmuring soft, meaningless words of comfort, not trying to fix her, just being there so she wouldn't have to drown alone. In those moments, Amara wasn't strong or brave, she was just human, fragile, broken, and desperately in need of someone to believe in her when she couldn't believe in herself. And Kenneth, listening to the raw honesty of her pain, loved her all the more fiercely for it. When her sobs finally subsided into hiccuping breaths, Amara looked up at him, her eyes red but burning with a fierce new resolve. "I don't want to give up," she whispered hoarsely. "Even if the whole world turns against me, I won't let them break me." Kenneth brushed a strand of hair from her face, his heart swelling with admiration. She didn't know it, but in that moment she had passed the final test. Not a test Kenneth had set, but one life itself had cruelly demanded. She had stood in the fire and emerged, scarred but unbroken. As Amara drifted into an exhausted sleep in his arms, Kenneth made his decision. He would not let her suffer any longer. The time had come to give her the life she deserved. The next step, the most important of all, was not just to help her survive, but to show her that love, true love, had always been standing right beside her, waiting. The beach was quiet that evening, the sun melting into the horizon in hues of deep gold and fiery crimson. Kenneth chose this place deliberately, simple, beautiful, and free, because it mirrored everything he loved about Amara. No grand ballrooms, no chandeliers or champagne, just the music of the waves and the soft whispers of the wind. Amara sat beside him on the cool sand, her bare toes tracing patterns absent-mindedly as they watched the tide roll in and out. She didn't know that Kenneth's heart was pounding harder than it ever had during any business deal, that inside the pocket of his worn jeans, his fingers nervously toyed with the simple silver ring he had bought earlier that day. It wasn't expensive, it wasn't flashy, but it was real. Just like everything he wanted their life together to be. Kenneth turned to face her, his chest tightening with a mixture of fear and hope. "Amara," he began, his voice barely audible above the waves, "I don't have much to offer you. Not money, not status." He paused, the irony of his words almost making him smile. "But I have a heart that belongs to you. I have loyalty, honesty, and love, the kind that doesn't disappear when life gets hard. I can't promise you an easy life, but I promise you won't face it alone." Amara turned to him, her eyes wide, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, Kenneth pulled the small box from his pocket and opened it to reveal the modest silver ring. "Will you marry me?" he asked, his voice breaking slightly. There was no grandeur in the proposal, no crowd to cheer, no cameras flashing. Just one broken man asking one broken woman if they could be whole together. Tears welled up in Amara's eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming purity of the moment. In Kenneth, she had found something she thought no longer existed. A man who loved her without conditions, without games, without pretense. She didn't see the dirt on his clothes or the calluses on his hands. She saw the soul shining behind his weary eyes, the love etched into every word he spoke. With trembling fingers, she took the ring and slid it onto her finger. It was a perfect fit, not because it was measured to size, but because it was measured to her heart. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Kenneth pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as the waves crashed around them, baptizing their new beginning. In that sacred moment, two hearts battered by life's storms fused together under the approving gaze of the setting sun, unaware of the incredible journey still ahead. The days leading up to the wedding were filled with quiet excitement and hidden preparations. Kenneth, still maintaining his humble disguise, carefully orchestrated every detail without letting Amara know the full extent of what he was planning. He wanted the moment of truth to be unforgettable, not just for her but for everyone who had ever doubted the power of pure love. Using his trusted personal assistant, who was sworn to absolute secrecy, Kenneth arranged for a grand venue to be booked under a different name. It wasn't a flashy hall lined with gold and glitter. It was an exquisite garden by a lake, lush with flowers and fairy lights, elegant yet simple, exactly what he believed Amara's soul deserved. Invitations were sent to a carefully selected list, people who mattered in his corporate world, key business partners, and a few high society names. They were simply told it was a private ceremony of someone very important, without revealing it was Kenneth Madu himself. Amara, unaware of the magnitude of what was being prepared, thought they would have a small, simple wedding with only a few friends. She happily busied herself sewing minor decorations by hand, even though Kenneth had already ordered the finest designers to arrange everything. She picked out a modest white dress from a thrift store, something beautiful but humble. Kenneth watched her with adoration as she twirled in the mirror, laughing shyly. She was thrilled, not because of wealth or grandeur, but because she was marrying the man who had stood with her through her worst days. Kenneth's heart ached with love and pride. He marveled at how differently life could look when viewed through the eyes of someone who valued the heart more than possessions. Every time he saw her simple joy, he knew he had made the right decision. No woman, no matter how stunning or wealthy, had ever moved his soul the way Amara did with her pure, selfless love. Behind the scenes, Kenneth's team ensured that everything would go perfectly. Limousines were arranged to pick up the guests, the security was discreet but tight, and the media was kept at bay under strict instructions. Only after the ceremony would the world be allowed to know who had gotten married, and to whom. Kenneth wasn't nervous about their love. He was nervous about the magnitude of the shock that was about to ripple through the lives of everyone who had mocked Amara, including David. He imagined David's smug face crumbling into disbelief and panic, the moment he realized that the woman he had discarded like trash was now the wife of the very man he sought to impress. Kenneth smiled privately at the thought, but more than revenge, his heart was focused on one thing: giving Amara the honor and happiness she deserved. The girl who had given her last sandwich to a beggar would soon be queen of a kingdom built not on money alone, but on love tested by fire. The morning of the wedding dawned with a soft golden hue, as if even the heavens knew something extraordinary was about to happen. Amara woke up early, her heart dancing with a mixture of nerves and excitement. She dressed in the simple white gown she had lovingly prepared, pinned a few tiny gardenias into her hair, and stood before the cracked mirror in her bedroom, smiling shyly at her reflection. She had no fancy jewelry, no professional makeup artist, no entourage of bridesmaids, but she felt like a queen. Today she would marry the man who had shown her that love was more powerful than circumstance. As she stepped out of her apartment, she was stunned to find a sleek black car waiting for her, driven by a man in a crisp suit. Confused but trusting, she allowed herself to be ushered in, her heart hammering in her chest as the car pulled smoothly away, heading toward a destination she didn't know. When the car finally stopped, Amara gasped. Before her stretched the most beautiful sight she had ever seen, a lakeside garden transformed into a dream. Rows of white chairs lined with delicate flowers, a golden arch dripping with vines, and fairy lights strung across the trees like stars plucked from the heavens. She stepped out hesitantly, her eyes wide with wonder. Guests in designer suits and elegant dresses milled about, all turning curiously to watch her approach. She felt out of place, like a sparrow among peacocks, but she held her head high, reminding herself that love, not wealth, was the reason she was here. She searched for Kenneth, needing to see the familiar face that anchored her, and when she found him standing at the altar, dressed in a simple but elegant black tuxedo, her heart nearly burst with love. He looked at her as if she were the only person in the universe. The ceremony began, the officiant's voice warm and gentle. Kenneth held her hands tightly, his palms trembling slightly. His eyes never left hers. Vows were exchanged, simple and raw. There were no grand speeches or extravagant promises, just two broken souls promising to walk the road of life together, no matter how rough or how bright. When the officiant finally declared them husband and wife, Kenneth leaned down and kissed her, sealing their covenant with tenderness and reverence. The guests clapped politely, still unsure exactly who they were witnessing, but sensing the profound love that hung in the air like a tangible force. As they walked back down the aisle, hand in hand, Amara felt like she was floating, unaware that in just a few moments her entire world, and the world's perception of her, was about to change forever. As Kenneth led Amara to the center of the garden, he signaled discreetly to the event organizer. The music faded. The murmuring of the guests died down. All eyes turned to the handsome groom who now stood, microphone in hand, beside his radiant new wife. Kenneth cleared his throat, his voice steady but his eyes glittering with emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his words slicing through the heavy silence, "thank you for coming to witness what, for me, is not just a wedding, but the fulfillment of a dream." A few polite claps followed, but the crowd, sensing that something unusual was about to happen, leaned forward in their seats. Kenneth smiled gently and continued, "I am not who many of you might think I am today. My name is Kenneth Chukwuma Medu, CEO of Medu Enterprises." Gasps rippled through the audience. Murmured whispers filled the air. Some guests visibly straightened, others blinked in astonishment, realizing they were standing in the presence of one of the most powerful men in the country. Amara stood frozen, her mind struggling to catch up with the revelation. Kenneth turned to her, taking her hands tenderly in his. "When I met you," he said softly, only for her ears now, "I had nothing in your eyes, no title, no wealth, just a broken man on the street. And you loved me anyway. You fed me, you sheltered me, you fought for me when you had no reason to. That love is more precious than anything I own." Tears streamed down Amara's face as the truth settled over her like a warm embrace. Kenneth wiped her tears with his thumb and whispered, "You loved me when I was nothing. Today everything I have is yours." He turned back to the crowd, raising her hand high in triumph. "I didn't marry a poor girl today," he declared. "I married the richest woman in the world, the one with the most beautiful heart." As the applause erupted, news outlets waiting outside the gates caught wind of the event, and soon the story flooded social media. Pictures of Amara, the once humble girl who had loved a beggar without knowing he was a billionaire, spread like wildfire. Meanwhile, miles away, in a luxury hotel where David was celebrating his pending contract with Alhaji Bako's daughter, he glanced at his phone, and froze. His hands trembled as he read headline after headline, "CEO Kenneth Medu marries former beggar's angel. David's ex now the queen of Medu Empire." David's face drained of color. His champagne flute slipped from his hand and shattered on the marble floor. Everything he had schemed for, every cruel move he had made, was unraveling in an instant. And this was only the beginning of his downfall. The world woke up to the news of Kenneth Madou's secret wedding, and the reactions were nothing short of explosive. Newspapers plastered Amara's picture on their front pages with bold, dramatic headlines. Social media boiled over with speculation, admiration, jealousy, and disbelief. Some lauded Kenneth for choosing love over status. Others scorned Amara, digging into her past in a desperate attempt to uncover any flaw they could exploit. But no amount of malice could dim the truth shining from every photograph, the pure, undeniable love between them. Paparazzi camped outside their lakeside estate for days, desperate for a glimpse of the new Cinderella of the streets, while influencers and bloggers churned out endless theories about how a poor girl could capture the heart of a billionaire. Kenneth's business partners, investors, and the corporate elite buzzed with curiosity, scrambling to secure invitations to the inevitable gala that Kenneth's marriage announcement would inspire. Yet inside the estate, far from the chaos of public curiosity, Amara and Kenneth lived in a cocoon of love and peace. Kenneth shielded her from the worst of the media storm, ensuring that she had everything she needed to feel secure and cherished. Amara found it surreal to go from struggling to afford a meal to having an entire staff at her beck and call, luxury clothes tailored to her figure, and jewelry she once could only dream about. But what amazed her most wasn't the wealth, it was the way Kenneth looked at her, the way he still preferred their quiet dinners in the garden over the grand banquets thrown in their honor. In his eyes, she wasn't a project or a trophy, she was his queen. And every day, Amara vowed to stay true to the woman who had once knelt beside a beggar and offered him her last sandwich, long before the world knew his name. Meanwhile, people from Amara's past surfaced like sharks sensing blood. Old friends who had once mocked her sent messages filled with syrupy congratulations. Distant relatives she hadn't heard from in years suddenly appeared, weaving tales of family loyalty and fabricated memories. Kenneth allowed her to decide who to allow back into her life and who to shut out. It was empowering, and Amara embraced it with grace. She forgave those who had been weak but kept her distance from those who had been cruel. She had learned that true love and true friendship didn't appear when the tables were full, they showed up when the plates were empty. With Kenneth by her side, she walked into her new life not as a rescued damsel but as a woman forged by trials, tempered by betrayal and crowned by love. David's life, once meticulously calculated for wealth and status, began to crumble faster than he could comprehend. The first blow came when Alhaji Bako, furious over the humiliation caused by the media frenzy surrounding Kenneth's wedding, called off the contract that David had been bragging about for months. In one phone call, everything David had bet his future on disappeared. His new fiancée, who had only agreed to the engagement based on the promise of a powerful alliance, wasted no time in cutting ties. She returned the engagement ring without a word, her face filled with disdain. Within a week, David found himself alone in the vast house he had moved into with dreams of grandeur, facing debts he had no means to pay and creditors circling like vultures. His once booming voice, full of arrogance and mockery, was now reduced to desperate whispers pleading for second chances that would never come. News of his downfall spread almost as quickly as Kenneth and Amara's wedding had. Former friends turned cold, business partners severed ties, and the few allies he had left suddenly found reasons to forget his name. David watched helplessly as his bank accounts were frozen, his cars repossessed, and his luxurious mansion put up for auction. The same people who had once laughed with him at Amara's expense now laughed at him, whispering that karma had finally caught up. David's nights were sleepless, haunted by visions of the girl he had thrown away living a life he could never even dream of touching again. He scoured the internet obsessively, watching videos of Amara and Kenneth attending charity events, launching initiatives for underprivileged youths, and smiling in a love so bright it made his own failures feel even darker. Regret gnawed at his soul like a relentless beast, leaving him hollow and bitter. But perhaps the cruelest blow of all came when David, desperate beyond pride, reached out to Kenneth's company seeking a chance to repair his reputation. He begged for a meeting, offering promises of loyalty and dedication. To his shock, the reply came swiftly, but not from Kenneth. It came from Amara. In a short, curt email signed with her new title as co-chair of the Madou Foundation, she denied his request with finality. There was no anger in her words, no gloating, only a calm professionalism that cut deeper than any insult. David stared at the screen for hours, the weight of his ruin pressing down on him until he could barely breathe. He realized too late that he had destroyed the only woman who had ever truly cared for him, and in doing so had sentenced himself to a life of misery he could never escape. Unable to accept defeat, David made one last desperate attempt to reclaim a piece of his former life. Dressed in a cheap suit borrowed from a cousin, He swallowed his pride and showed up at the headquarters of Medu Enterprises, demanding to see Kenneth or Amara. Security turned him away at first, but his persistence was pathetic enough that news reached Amara, who, after much deliberation, agreed to meet him, not out of kindness but for closure. When David walked into the gleaming lobby of the building he once thought he would conquer through connections and deceit, he felt the full weight of what he had lost. Amara stood waiting for him, poised and elegant in a tailored suit that spoke of quiet authority. She was everything he had once sneered at, and now everything he could never reach again. David fell to his knees before her, tears streaming down his face. "Please," he begged, his voice broken, "give me another chance. Help me, Amara. I was wrong. I was stupid. Please. I have nothing left." The irony was suffocating. The same man who once mocked her tears now drowned in his own. But Amara, though her heart ached with the memories of the girl she once was, did not falter. She knelt down, not to comfort him but to meet his eyes, and said in a voice both gentle and unbreakable, "When you threw me away you didn't just betray me, you betrayed yourself. There's no going back, David. Not now, not ever." She stood up, brushing invisible dust from her skirt as if shaking off the last remnants of a life that no longer had any power over her. Without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving David sobbing on the cold marble floor, alone in the very emptiness he had crafted with his own hands. As she stepped into the elevator, Amara took a deep breath, feeling the final chains of her past fall away. She wasn't the broken girl anymore, begging for love and acceptance. She was a woman who had weathered storms, survived betrayals and emerged victorious. Beside her, waiting with a proud smile and outstretched hand, was Kenneth, the man who had seen her worth even when the world turned its back. Together they rose, leaving behind the ruins of a past that could no longer touch them, and stepping boldly into a future built on love, trust, and a strength that no wealth or status could ever match. The meeting with David marked a turning point not just for him but for Amara as well. As she walked back into her office, her heart pounded, not with sadness but with a profound sense of closure. She had faced the man who once belittled her, broke her spirit, and nearly destroyed her dreams. She had looked him in the eyes without anger or bitterness, just strength. The girl who once cowered under his words was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her worth. As Kenneth entered the room behind her, he didn't need to ask what happened. He simply embraced her, the kind of embrace that spoke of pride, love, and unwavering support. For Amara, it was more than just personal victory, it was reclaiming her narrative. She wasn't the rejected girl anymore. She was the woman who rose from the ashes and refused to let hatred dictate her story. Word of David's humiliation spread like wildfire in the business community. Whispers filled corporate boardrooms and luxury lounges, how the once promising young businessman had been reduced to begging at the feet of the very woman he scorned. Even those who once sided with him turned their backs, seeing now that aligning with a sinking ship could only pull them under too. As Amara's story gained more attention, she didn't use it to boast or seek revenge. Instead, she used her growing influence to create change. Under her leadership, the Medu Foundation expanded its efforts to empower struggling entrepreneurs, provide scholarships for underprivileged students, and establish shelters for abused women. Kenneth supported her vision wholeheartedly, proud to see the woman he loved transform her pain into purpose. Together they built not just an empire of wealth, but an empire of hope. Meanwhile, David spiraled deeper into ruin. His former fiancée became engaged to another powerful heir within weeks. His family, embarrassed by the scandal, publicly disowned him. He tried to rebuild, taking odd jobs far beneath the station he once mocked others for holding, but the shame followed him everywhere. At night, he would sit alone in cheap rented rooms, scrolling through social media feeds filled with pictures of Amara, radiant, respected, beloved, beside Kenneth. It was a constant, unbearable reminder that he had gambled away something priceless for the fleeting illusion of status. And no matter how many times he replayed his mistakes in his mind, no matter how many ways he tried to rewrite history in his head, the truth remained brutal and unchanging. He had destroyed his own future with his own hands. The last of David's possessions slipped through his fingers like sand. His mansion was sold at auction to pay off his mounting debts. His luxury car, the symbol of his false success, was repossessed in broad daylight, drawing the pitying and judgmental stares of former neighbors. Even the clothes he once flaunted with arrogance were now pawned for mere survival. With no friends left to turn to and no family willing to claim him, David's days became a series of humiliations. Job applications were rejected with thinly veiled disgust. Word of his downfall had poisoned even entry-level opportunities. Landlords turned him away, unwilling to rent to someone whose reputation for betrayal and dishonor had spread like wildfire. Stripped of all his pretenses, David finally saw the world he had once scorned. A world where character mattered more than wealth, and where a broken heart could be far stronger than a full wallet. Meanwhile, Kenneth and Amara soared higher than ever. Their marriage, once whispered about with skepticism, became a shining example of love that defied societal norms. Amara's leadership at the Medu Foundation earned her accolades and awards, but what she valued most were the lives she touched. The children who could now attend school, the women who found shelter from abusive homes, the young men and women who started businesses and carved new futures for themselves. Every time she stood before a crowd and spoke about resilience and hope, she thought back to the darkest days when she had nothing but the stubborn refusal to give up. Kenneth stood beside her, never overshadowing her, always uplifting her. He understood that her strength didn't diminish his own, it magnified it. Together they built a legacy not just of wealth, but of compassion and change, a legacy that would outlive them both. In one final act of desperation, David tried to contact Amara again, this time through a mutual acquaintance. But the message never reached her. Kenneth's legal team had standing orders to block any harassment from David's direction. Realizing that all doors were permanently closed, David retreated into obscurity. He lived the remainder of his days wandering the very streets where Kenneth had once pretended to be a beggar. But unlike Kenneth, David wore his poverty not as a disguise, but as a permanent sentence. A grim reminder that cruelty and arrogance could strip a man of everything while kindness and humility could raise a woman to heights no one had ever dreamed she would reach. In losing Amara, David hadn't just lost a girlfriend. He had lost his soul. The years that followed were filled with a kind of happiness Amara had once believed was reserved for fairy tales. She and Kenneth traveled the world together, exploring places she had only read about in books. The Eiffel Tower's glittering lights, the ancient streets of Rome, the serene beaches of the Maldives. Yet despite all the grandeur, their happiest moments were always the simplest. Watching sunsets from their garden, laughing over spilled coffee in the kitchen, holding hands during late-night walks. Kenneth made sure she knew every single day how deeply she was loved, not through grand gestures alone, but through quiet, consistent devotion. He reminded her that the girl who once gave her last sandwich to a beggar was the same woman who had won his heart forever. Amara never forgot where she came from. She remained humble despite her wealth, using her position to amplify the voices of those often ignored. She set up programs for single mothers, sponsored scholarships for children in impoverished villages, and built hospitals in places where healthcare had once been a distant dream. Everywhere she went, she told her story, not to boast but to inspire. She spoke of resilience, faith, and the power of kindness in a world obsessed with appearances. Her story became a beacon for thousands, a living proof that true worth is measured not by riches but by the capacity to love and to endure. And wherever she stood, Kenneth stood with her, not behind her, not above her, but beside her, the way real love should always be. As they celebrated their 5th wedding anniversary with a quiet dinner overlooking the lake where they had married, Kenneth pulled Amara close and whispered, "You saved me, you know." She smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "No," she replied. "We saved each other." And as they gazed at the shimmering water reflecting the stars above, they both knew that the storms of the past had only strengthened the foundation of their love. Their journey had not been easy. It had been built through fire, through heartbreak, through the kind of trials that break most people. But because they had faced those storms together, with honesty, humility, and unwavering loyalty, their love was unshakable. In a world full of fragile, fleeting things, their bond was forever. Years later, Kenneth and Amara stood hand in hand at the edge of a bustling street corner, not in designer clothes, not surrounded by security details or cameras, but dressed simply, blending in with the very world where their story had begun. The city buzzed around them with life. Hawkers shouting prices, children weaving between traffic, beggars sitting against cracked walls, holding out trembling hands. Kenneth took a deep breath, feeling the hum of the streets in his bones. It was here, in places just like this, that he had once knelt in rags, searching desperately for a heart pure enough to love him without knowing his name. And it was here that he had found Amara, the woman who had seen a stranger's suffering and answered with compassion. Today they were back, not as broken souls, but as builders of hope, returning to plant seeds where despair once ruled. Beside them, a new building stood tall and proud, a shelter funded by the Medu Foundation, bearing a plaque that read, "For those who see beyond appearances, and for those brave enough to believe in second chances." Inside its colorful walls, dozens of homeless men, women, and children found refuge, food, education, and a path back to dignity. As Kenneth and Amara toured the shelter, greeting residents with genuine warmth, the memories flooded back like an emotional tide. Kenneth remembered the cold nights sleeping on broken benches, the hunger gnawing at his insides, the invisible walls society built around people who had nothing. Amara remembered the hopelessness she had once faced, the sting of rejection, the heavy loneliness of being abandoned by those she trusted. And yet, standing here together, they were living proof that life's cruelest storms could be turned into rivers of blessing if met with courage, love, and perseverance. When the ribbon was finally cut and cheers echoed through the courtyard, Kenneth turned to Amara and kissed her forehead, whispering, "This is our legacy." She smiled, tears sparkling in her eyes, not tears of sadness but of overwhelming gratitude. They had risen not because they were lucky or powerful, but because they had chosen each other when the world had nothing to offer. Looking out at the smiling faces of the shelter's new residents, Kenneth and Amara knew they had come full circle. They had been broken, yes. Betrayed, yes. Mocked, abandoned, forgotten. But in the end, love had been enough. Love had been more than enough. And as the sun dipped behind the city skyline, casting a golden glow over the streets where their story had first begun, Kenneth and Amara walked hand in hand into the future, still believing, still loving, and still daring to see the beauty that lies hidden beneath the dirt of broken dreams. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel Tales by Tochi for more.